in the different ways our minds think. They're, the mind thinks on different levels. One level is called initial or sort of primary thought, and that's the reaction that our minds have to what's around us. We notice it's hot, we notice it's light or dark. We have these thoughts that arise about what's happening in our lives. The second layer of thought is discriminative thinking is what it's referred to in Buddhism. But really what it is, it's the story that we tell ourselves about the thought. So if we have a thought that it's cold, we start thinking, well, I better go get a jacket. Where's my jacket? Oh, it's in the other room. I better go in the other room to get it. So it's the story we build around the initial thought. Initial thoughts happen. They arise, they're reactions to our environment, to what's going on. They can take many, many forms, but they're just the initial reaction to whatever's going on. We can't control those because that's the way our human existence, our human minds work. What we can have a choice about is the stories that we tell ourselves, because the stories are usually not very necessary. And if we don't notice the stories and we don't notice how we create them, the stories can go on forever. I mean, we can think about we're cold, and then we have the story come in that says, I need my jacket. And then we start thinking about the jacket, and it reminds us of the story of the jacket that Aunt Mary had when she was 23, because it was green just like my jacket. And Aunt Mary lived on B Street, I think, and didn't she have that little house that had the white picket fence? And her son's name, I think, was George. George went to college, I think, in Connecticut. And the story just, and then the next thing you know, an hour's gone by, you're still on the same story. It has nothing to do with going to get your jacket. You may not have even gone to get your jacket. You have gotten lost in thought, in the story that was based around the initial, immediate response to your environment. I'm cold. There's nothing wrong with this. That's the way our minds work. But sometimes we misuse those stories. We create stories that aren't true. We create stories that are negative. We create stories that are misperceptions about what's going on. And we make ourselves suffer because of the stories we tell ourselves. You know, something happens and it's, oh gosh, you know, I'm at a loss for words tonight on stories. I usually have all these stories coming up. And let's just say, you know, I'll just pick one. You have a job and they send you a paycheck every day, every week in the mail, and the paycheck doesn't show up. And it's like, all of a sudden you start making up a story. Well, what happened to the check? I wonder, maybe someone was supposed to call me and tell me that I wasn't working there anymore. And if I'm not working, then how am I going to pay my bill? I mean, the stories can be very negative, I guess is my point. So we can create suffering around circumstances that have nothing to do with anything, quite frankly. We just start to tell ourselves these amazing stories that are they're like movies almost in some cases. And in most cases, it seems, unfortunately, I don't know if it's conditioning as cultural conditioning or just the nature of how humans are, we seem to be better at telling bad stories than we do about good stories. You know, we rarely make things better in our stories in our head. We tend to make them worse. If on average, I'd say. I mean, sometimes we do, but I think overall, I think most people tend to want to spin a negative story because, just like the news, I mean, the news reports negative stories because they're interesting, they're dramatic, they're full of excitement and tension and we have that part of us that sort of gets a thrill out of those negative emotions. That's why people like horror movies and action movies, because they're stimulated. So negativity sometimes is stimulating, but it also causes us to suffer in most cases. So the idea of applying this ability to notice what's going on in our minds is an attempt to have a choice as to whether or not we're going to have the story. And there's layers to this. The first thing is noticing that the story is actually started. And that takes practice. That takes putting some effort into watching the way your mind works. It's like observing your mind a little bit. It's like you need to sort of, if you want to pursue this, what you need to do is train yourself to notice the initial thought. And then wait for the story to start. As soon as the story starts, to just notice that it's the story and decide whether you need to have that sequence of events roll out through your mind. And again, there is no goal here, there is no reason not to have stories. It's all about choice. It's learning how to have the choice so that we can stop the stories we know are not productive. It isn't to stop all stories. I mean, stories are entertaining. We entertain ourselves with our stories in our mind. We're walking down the street and everything's coming at us, all the stimulus, and we're thinking this and that and the other, and we like what we see in the store window. We wonder who that person is walking up to us. I wonder if whatever, just all those things are what entertains us. And there's nothing wrong with that. That's, it's okay. But that same function in our minds is also what spins the stories that cause us to suffer. And so by learning to learning a little bit more about how our minds work, we can employ a little bit more control over what we want to and don't want to think. If you ask the normal person on the street, can you control what you think? I would say most people say no. They can't at all. They go, I don't know where all this stuff comes from. It just sometimes my mind just goes wild, and it's like racing horses, and I can't stop it, and thoughts are coming one after another, and I'm just, I'm exhausted. My mind exhausts me. Well, that's true, because the way our bodies and minds work is kind of a circular event, and thoughts create emotions, and emotions create action. I call it T-E-A. So our minds have tea with ourselves. So we have this thought, and the thought usually stimulates an emotion. Let's say it's fear. Well, fear creates a bodily reaction, tension, stress. So a thought creates an emotion, creates an action. The way to stop that, and that wears us out. I mean, again, sometimes I forget to talk about why it's important or why it makes any sense at all to stop some of these things. So one of the things that tires us out, one of the things that saps us of our energy and our ability to enjoy what we do want to enjoy, is that we're, as a culture, we're constantly worn out by our daily lives, by the stress and anxiety and fears that we feel on a daily basis. So in order to get a little bit of control over those things, to sort of reduce that stress in our lives, again, we have to know where it comes from. We have to observe ourselves and see, well, what's going on? Why is this happening? And it's an interesting thing about the mind is when we can identify these things, when we notice them, that automatically gives us a little bit of control over them and gives us the choice to decide whether or not we want this to go on or if we just want to put it aside. And one of the things I tell people in meditation, when they're learning meditation, is to watch the initial thoughts arise. They just arise like bubbles in a champagne glass. We don't know where they come from. They come from somewhere. There's a lot of philosophy, a lot of thoughts about where mind comes from, where thoughts come from. But the one thing we can notice is when the thought arises and the story starts, if we identify the beginning of the story, we can literally tell ourselves, not now. I'm not going to have this story now. It's just not useful right now. And it's easy. Once you notice this, it's quite easy to put the story aside, you'll find. Because every time the story starts, you just go, no, I'm not going to do that. Not now. The initial thought will still be there, or another thought will come and take its place. If we can if we can intercede with a thought and hold it for 90 seconds, a thought will go away. This has been scientifically proven. Thoughts last about 90 seconds if we don't regenerate them. Now, of course, we can have a thought, and within that 90 seconds have the thought again, and it will regenerate. But if we can hold that thought and not engage it, not fall into a story, and not emotionally connect to that thought, if you can do that for 90 seconds, it will go away. That's one of the coping mechanisms they teach people that have anxiety and panic attacks. If you can hold the emotion of connecting with that thought that's causing you anxiety or panic for 90 seconds, it'll go away. It might come back, and you have to hold it again, and then it will eventually stop coming back up. So it's just understanding a little bit about the way our minds work allows us to have a little bit more control over the suffering that we cause ourselves. Because suffering, Buddhism's all about suffering, some people say it. I don't personally believe that, but the Four Noble Truths say that there's suffering. And the second noble truth is that there's a cause for suffering. And the third noble truth, the other two noble truths, which I can't remember exactly sequentially, is there's a reason for it and there's a way out of it.